All right, let's dive right in. We're going to tackle a huge question in politics today. What really matters more in a leader, their personal character or their policies? We're going to break down a source that lays out a really specific way of thinking about this. And, it's a dilemma a lot of us face. So let's just put the question right out there, the one at the very heart of this whole discussion. Can someone we see as a bad person, someone who's morally flawed, actually be a good leader, maybe even a great one? It's a tough one, and it creates this real, sometimes pretty uncomfortable tension for a lot of voters. Now, the source document we're digging into calls this feeling cognitive dissonance. You know that weird mental static you get when you're trying to believe two totally opposite things at once? That's it. And this analysis looks specifically at how supporters of really polarizing figures manage to square that circle, how they reconcile what they might see as, questionable character with policies they feel are exactly what the country needs. So, how do they do it? Well, to make sense of this dissonance, the source introduces a pretty powerful idea it calls the imperfect vessel framework. It's this concept that a leader, even a really flawed one, can be seen as the right tool, the right instrument for getting a much bigger job done. Okay, so how does this framework actually work in people's minds? The source breaks it down into a few key arguments. You've got the purely pragmatic ones, like just separating a leader's private life from their public duties. Basically, focusing on policies, not their personality. Then there's the more strategic view, the whole fighting fire with fire idea. The analysis also points to history and even the Bible for examples of flawed leaders who got the job done. And finally, it kind of just says, look, feeling this tension? It's actually pretty normal. And this quote from the source, wow, it just hits the nail on the head for that pragmatic argument. It asks, are we voting for a pastor or are we voting for someone to run a country? See what it does? It frames the whole choice as a practical one. Are you looking for moral purity or are you looking for someone you think can actually govern effectively? And the source is quick to point out, hey, this is not a new problem, not at all. History is absolutely packed with these imperfect vessels. It brings up Winston Churchill, a guy known for being arrogant, who drank a lot, but was absolutely essential in defeating Nazi Germany. Then there's JFK, a known womanizer who, stared down the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The source even goes way back to King David from the Bible, who did some truly terrible things, but is still remembered as one of Israel's greatest kings. All right, so with that whole framework laid out, the source then takes these ideas and applies them to a few modern leaders to really draw some direct comparisons. And this is where the analysis gets super specific. It looks at Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and basically says, okay, here you have leaders with high marks in both the moral and political columns. But then it contrasts them with Donald Trump, who it describes as morally compromised but still politically impactful. So, according to this source, Thatcher and Reagan are kind of the ideal, where integrity and effectiveness go hand in hand, while Trump represents this case where those two things really pull apart. And then the analysis takes this huge turn. It pivots from comparing politicians with each other to this much bigger theological idea. It contrasts all these earthly leaders with Jesus Christ, framing the difference as one of temporary versus eternal impact. The idea here, from the source's perspective, is that political leaders are stuck managing temporary problems inside broken human systems. But Jesus' mission, that's presented as something that completely transcends politics, something aimed at solving the root cause of human problems forever. This quote really sums up the document's entire hierarchy of leadership. It says that even the very best political leaders are only shadows of the perfect leader, Jesus Christ. So, from this point of view, the most important thing to remember is that any human leader is going to be imperfect when you measure them against a divine standard. But the analysis doesn't stop there. It then shifts to explain why some people might see a combative, flawed leader as not just okay, but actually necessary. This is what the source calls the justifying context. And the whole argument really boils down to that old saying, desperate diseases require desperate remedies. The source basically argues that the current state of Western society is so bad, it literally describes it as being filled with total lunacy, that it demands a really drastic, maybe even an unconventional response. So what does it mean by that? Well, it points to things it sees as major contradictions in the justice system. It highlights cases where it feels like ideology is just trampling all over common sense, giving examples tied to free speech, gender identity, and public protests. According to the source, this is the desperate disease that needs a powerful, unconventional remedy. And to back all this up, the source pulls from the history books. It draws these direct lines between what it sees happening now and other times that considers periods of major decline. It brings up the late Roman Empire, Germany's Weimar Republic before the Nazis, and even Mao's Cultural Revolution in China, arguing that we're seeing the same old patterns of societal decay playing out again. So, after laying out the problem, the framework, and all this historical context, how does the source actually wrap it all up? How does it solve that initial puzzle? Let's get to its final takeaway. In the end, this is where the document lands. In the real world, in politics, we're always going to be choosing between flawed human beings. There's no escaping it. But it suggests, for people of faith, that anxiety is softened by a belief in an ultimate, perfect leader who exists on a divine level, completely above the messiness of human politics. And to close out its entire argument, the source leaves us with this scriptural quote about getting through tough times. It says, "My son, peace be unto thy soul. Thine adversity shall be but a small moment." It's really a message of hope, framing all the political struggles we're seeing right now as just temporary noise in the grand scheme of things. So after breaking all that down, we kind of end up right back where we started, with that fundamental question. Now, this source gave us one very specific, faith-based way of looking at it, but the question is still out there for all of us. How should a society, how should we balance a leader's personal character against their policies?